David Thompson was living the dream. A successful business, a loving fiancée, and a future that seemed full of promise. But beneath the surface of his perfect life, something felt off. Her family smiled at him, praised him, celebrated his achievements, but behind their kind words was an uneasy question he couldn't shake. Did they really see him as an equal, or just as a man who had beaten the odds? One day, David decided to find out the truth. And it was more than he ever expected. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. David Thompson was the kind of man people couldn't help but admire. His success story was one for the ages. A brilliant entrepreneur who had built his tech empire from scratch. But beyond his success, it was his humility and warmth that made people gravitate toward him. He was the type of man who never forgot where he came from, despite the luxury that now surrounded him. In a world obsessed with status, David's grounded nature was refreshing. His fiancée, Emily Harrison, was everything he could have asked for in a partner: kind, intelligent, and compassionate. Emily wasn't just beautiful in the traditional sense, though her golden curls and bright blue eyes turned heads wherever she went. She had an inner beauty that made people feel seen and heard. To David, she was the embodiment of grace, the perfect balance to his sometimes work-driven intensity. The two of them together seemed like the ideal match. Emily came from a wealthy, influential family, the Harrisons, who were known for their philanthropic efforts and deep roots in old money circles. At first glance, it seemed like David and Emily's relationship was seamless, a blending of two worlds, David's humble beginnings and Emily's privileged upbringing. Their love had bridged the gap, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, David had begun to sense that things were more complicated than they appeared. David had been introduced to Emily's family several months into their relationship. The Harrisons had been polite, perhaps overly so, and seemed to accept him without issue. Charles Harrison, Emily's father, was a tall, imposing man with a quiet confidence that spoke to a lifetime of power and wealth. He had given David the firm handshake of a businessman and welcomed him to dinner with an air of formality. Margaret, Emily's mother, had been more effusive, immediately commenting on how handsome David was, as if his looks alone were his most impressive feature. Her smile had been genuine, but David couldn't help feeling that there was something forced in the way she spoke to him. At first, David tried to ignore these feelings. He told himself that he was simply overanalyzing the situation. After all, it wasn't unusual to feel a little out of place in such a high-society family, especially considering his own background. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, David had learned to work for everything he had. He was used to navigating spaces where he didn't quite fit in. But as the months passed, those small slights, those subtle comments and looks began to pile up. It started with innocuous-seeming remarks, like when Charles had casually asked David about his upbringing over a family dinner. "So, David," Charles began, "I imagine it must have been quite the journey, growing up where you did and making it here." His tone was friendly enough, but there was something in the way he emphasized the word "here" that made David pause. David smiled politely. "It's been a lot of hard work, but I had great support from my family. My parents always pushed me to aim high, even when things were tough." Charles nodded slowly. "Quite remarkable, really. Most people don't manage to rise above their circumstances the way you have." He took a sip of his wine and added, "You're one of the lucky ones." "Lucky?" The word hung in the air like a mild insult disguised as praise. David felt the familiar pang in his chest, that subtle reminder that despite all he had accomplished, there were still people who saw him as an anomaly. He wasn't just a successful man in their eyes, he was a successful black man, and that distinction carried weight. He knew it wasn't malicious, but it stung nonetheless. As the weeks went on, David started paying closer attention to the Harrisons' behavior. It wasn't just Charles. Margaret, too, had a way of talking about him that made him feel like a novelty. She would gush over his achievements, often in a tone that was more surprised than impressed. "You're just so well-spoken," she had told him one evening at a dinner party. "I mean, it's clear that you've worked so hard to get to where you are. It's really admirable." David had smiled, but inside, the words twisted. Well-spoken. It wasn't the first time he had heard that compliment, and it wouldn't be the last. He knew what it meant, though. It was code for "you speak better than I expected you to." Even Emily's brother, Tom, who had initially seemed indifferent to David, had begun to reveal his true feelings. Tom was the type of man who had never known struggle, coasting through life on his family's name and wealth. His casual arrogance was a product of a world where privilege shielded him from any real consequences. David had hoped to find common ground with Tom, perhaps bond over business or shared interests, but Tom seemed to view David as a curiosity rather than a future brother-in-law. So what was it like being the only black guy in a room full of investors? Tom had asked one night over drinks, a smug grin on his face. Must have been interesting. David had shrugged, keeping his tone even. "I didn't really think about it like that. I was there to do business." Tom had raised an eyebrow. "Come on, man. You're telling me no one treated you differently? You're not exactly the usual type they let into those circles." David had clenched his jaw, forcing a smile. "I don't let that get in the way of what I'm trying to accomplish." Tom had laughed. "Good for you, man. I guess it helps to be, a little tougher than the rest of us." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Tom saw him as an outsider, someone who had managed to break into a world where he didn't belong. It wasn't malicious, not in the overt sense, but it was a constant reminder that David's place in their world was conditional and always subject to scrutiny. Through it all, Emily remained blissfully unaware of the subtle digs and hidden prejudices. She loved David for who he was, and she couldn't see the small cracks in the foundation of her family's acceptance. Whenever David tried to bring it up, she would brush it off, insisting that her family adored him. "They're just trying to get to know you better," she would say. "They're a little old-fashioned, sure, but they mean well." David wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the Harrisons were simply adjusting to the idea of their daughter marrying someone outside their social circle. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The longer he spent with them, the more he realized that their acceptance of him wasn't as genuine as it seemed. One night, after another family dinner filled with thinly veiled compliments and awkward silences, David sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. Emily found him there, her face filled with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, sitting beside him. David hesitated, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. I don't know if your family really sees me, Emily. I feel like they're only accepting me because of what I've achieved, not because of who I am." Emily frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" David sighed. "I mean, if I wasn't successful, if I didn't have the money or the business, would they still accept me? Or would they see me differently?" Emily was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "David, my family loves you. They're just a little old-fashioned, like I said, but they'll come around." David nodded, though the doubt lingered. He knew Emily meant well, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her family's acceptance was fragile, built on the surface level of his success rather than the deeper understanding of who he was as a person. And that was when the idea first began to take root in his mind. If they didn't truly see him now, perhaps he needed to show them a different side of himself. A side that they wouldn't recognize. Maybe, just maybe, if they saw him as someone ordinary, they would reveal their true colors. And so the seed of a plan was planted, one that would test everything he thought he knew about Emily's family. The idea had started as a whisper in David's mind, a fleeting thought he hadn't fully expected to take root. But the more he mulled it over, the more it began to solidify. What if he could see the truth? What if he could strip away the layers of politeness and social niceties and expose what Emily's family really thought about him, or people like him, when they weren't putting on their best behavior? It wasn't that he wanted to catch them out of spite or prove them wrong. No, that wasn't it. It was more about clarity. David didn't want to spend the rest of his life feeling like he was constantly walking on eggshells, unsure of where he truly stood. If he was going to marry into this family, if he was going to build a future with Emily, he needed to know, really know, that he was accepted for who he was, not just for what he had achieved. Emily was supportive of him, but even she didn't fully grasp the weight of his concerns. She often dismissed his observations as mere misunderstandings, claiming that her family was harmless, just a bit out of touch. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something that wouldn't be resolved by time alone. The idea kept gnawing at him until one evening, as they sat together on the couch watching TV, David turned to Emily and voiced the thought out loud. "I think I want to test them," he said suddenly. His voice steady but tentative, as if testing the waters. Emily glanced at him, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Test who?" "Your family," David replied, watching her reaction carefully. "I want to see how they treat me. Or someone like me, if they didn't know who I really was." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She sat up straighter, turning to face him fully. "What do you mean? Like, pretend to be someone else?" David nodded slowly. "Yeah, something like that. I was thinking, what if I went undercover, disguised as someone who works at McDonald's or something? They wouldn't recognize me, and I could see how they treat people when they think no one important is watching." For a moment, Emily was silent, clearly processing what David had just suggested. The idea was certainly unconventional, even a little wild, but David could see the gears turning in her mind, and he knew she understood what he was getting at. "That's an interesting idea," she said finally, her voice measured. "But don't you think it's a little risky? What if they find out? And what if it changes things between you and them, between us?" David considered her words. He had already thought about the risks. If the experiment went poorly, if he discovered something he didn't want to know, it could indeed change everything. But wasn't that the point? To know for sure one way or another? "I know it's risky," David admitted, "but I need to know. I need to understand how they really see me. And not just me, but people who aren't as successful or wealthy. I want to see if their kindness extends to everyone, or if it's just a facade they put on for people they think are worth their time." Emily's expression softened. She reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I get it, David. I do. If this will give you peace of mind, then I'll support you. But just be careful, okay? My family isn't perfect, but I know they can change." David nodded, grateful for her understanding. "I'll be careful," he promised. "But I need to do this." And so, the plan began to take shape. David would pose as a McDonald's employee at a location where Emily's family frequently stopped by during their outings. It was a fast food restaurant in a part of town where the Harrisons were known for their weekend excursions, always grabbing a quick bite to eat before heading off to a gallery opening, a charity event, or some other high society function. They wouldn't be expecting him, and with the right disguise, they wouldn't recognize him. The thought of going undercover thrilled David, but it also filled him with nervous anticipation. He had never done anything like this before, and the stakes felt high. But there was no turning back now. He was determined to see this through. The following week, David began preparing for his transformation. He wasn't sure how thorough his disguise needed to be, but he knew he had to at least alter his appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition. He grew out his beard, trimmed it scruffier than usual, and wore glasses with large, thick frames. On the day of the experiment, he dressed in the standard McDonald's uniform, black slacks, a branded polo shirt, and a cap pulled low over his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him blend in as just another employee. As he looked at himself in the mirror that morning, David hardly recognized the man staring back at him. The polished, confident businessman was gone, replaced by an average worker ready to serve customers. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was this really the right thing to do? Would this test give him the answers he was seeking? Or would it only complicate things further? He pushed the doubt aside. He had come too far to back out now. Arriving at the McDonald's where Emily's family would soon be dining, David felt a strange sense of excitement mixed with trepidation. The manager, a kind older woman named Sandra, had been more than willing to let him work a shift under the guise of being a new hire in training. She didn't ask too many questions, clearly amused by the idea of a wealthy businessman wanting to experience life as a fast food worker, even if only for a day. "You sure you're ready for this?" Sandra asked with a smile as she handed him an apron. David grinned back, though his stomach was doing flips. I think so. The lunch rush was just beginning when David spotted Emily's family entering the restaurant. Charles, Margaret, and Tom strolled in, chatting animatedly about their upcoming plans. They didn't give a second glance to the employees behind the counter, and David breathed a sigh of relief. So far, so good. He positioned himself at the register, ready to take their order. Margaret stepped up first, glancing at the menu before ordering a salad and iced tea. She smiled politely at David, though there was no sign of recognition in her eyes. Charles followed, ordering a burger and fries with the same casual indifference he would give to a waiter at an upscale restaurant. Tom, as usual, appeared distracted, his attention focused more on his phone than on the people around him. David served them their food with a practiced smile, his heart pounding in his chest. As they sat down to eat, he moved to the back of the restaurant, out of their line of sight, and observed. The real test wasn't just how they treated him, but how they interacted with the other employees and the environment around them. At first, everything seemed normal. Emily's family chatted, laughed, and ate without much fanfare. But then, as the meal progressed, small cracks began to show in their behavior. Charles, usually composed and charming, started to grumble about the speed of service, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. Margaret made a comment about how the restaurant seemed less clean than the last time they'd visited, and Tom, ever the entitled one, complained about his fries being too salty, tossing them aside without a second thought. It wasn't outright cruelty, but the subtle air of superiority was unmistakable. David watched as they treated the staff with indifference, their politeness masking an undercurrent of disdain. To them, the workers weren't people with stories or struggles. They were just part of the background, there to serve and fade away. David's heart sank as he realized what he had feared all along. Without his wealth and status, without the shield of success that made him worthy in their eyes, Emily's family saw him, and people like him, as less than. His disguise had done its job, revealing the truth he had hoped he wouldn't find. As David clocked out of his shift that day, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He had his answer, but it wasn't the one he had wanted. Emily's family, despite their outward kindness, harbored deep-seated prejudices that surfaced when they thought no one important was watching. Now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. David hadn't slept well the night before. His mind was restless, replaying the events of the day at McDonald's, the subtle slights, and the indifference that seemed to seep through Emily's family once the mask of politeness was lifted. He had hoped for something different, hoped that, even without his success, they would show genuine respect and empathy for those they considered ordinary or beneath them. But what he had witnessed was an unsettling confirmation of his worst fears. The next morning, he found himself sitting at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall, as the weight of the situation bore down on him. He had gone into this experiment, believing that it would either confirm his suspicions or lay them to rest. But now that he had the answers, they didn't bring him the closure he had hoped for. Instead, they opened up a new set of problems he wasn't sure how to solve. Emily noticed his quiet mood almost immediately. She had always been sensitive to his emotions, and today was no different. As she sat beside him brushing her hair, she glanced over with concern in her eyes. "You've been awfully quiet since yesterday," she said softly, her tone gentle but probing. David blinked, pulling himself out of his thoughts. "Yeah, just thinking." Emily set down her brush and turned fully toward him, her face etched with worry. "About the test? How did it go? What did you find out?" David hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He didn't want to hurt Emily, but he also knew that hiding the truth wouldn't help either of them. She deserved to know what had happened, even if it meant facing uncomfortable realities about her family. "It didn't go as well as I hoped," David admitted finally, his voice tinged with disappointment. Emily frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean? Did they recognize you?" David shook his head. "No, they didn't recognize me. That wasn't the problem." Emily leaned in, her concern deepening. "Then what happened?" Taking a deep breath, David recounted the events of the day before, the way her family had acted, the subtle ways they had shown their disdain for the workers at the restaurant. He told her about Charles' impatience, Margaret's veiled comments about cleanliness, and Tom's casual dismissal of the staff as if they were invisible. As he spoke, he could see the realization dawning on Emily's face, her expression growing more pained with each word. "I didn't want to believe it," David said, his voice softer now. "I didn't want to think that your family could be like that. But when they thought no one important was watching, they showed who they really are. And it wasn't pretty." Emily sat in stunned silence for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know what to say. That doesn't sound like them at all." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I didn't want to believe it either. But it happened, Emily. I saw it with my own eyes." For a long moment, the room was filled with a heavy silence. Emily's mind was clearly racing as she tried to process what David had told her. She had always known her family wasn't perfect, but this was something different. She had never seen them through the eyes of someone like David, someone who had experienced prejudice firsthand. To her, they had always been her loving, if sometimes flawed, family. But now she was forced to confront a side of them she hadn't fully understood. "Maybe," Emily began, her voice tentative, "maybe they didn't mean it the way it came across. My dad can be a little grumpy when he's hungry, and Tom, well, you know how he is. He doesn't always think before he speaks." David looked at her, his expression somber but understanding. "I get that, Emily, but this wasn't just a bad mood or a careless remark. It was deeper than that. It's the way they see people who aren't like them, people who don't have the same privileges or wealth. When they thought I was just another worker, they treated me and everyone else like we didn't matter." Emily's eyes welled up with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. "I don't want to believe that about them, David. I know my family isn't perfect, but they're good people. I don't understand why they would act like that." David's heart ached at the sight of Emily's distress. He loved her deeply, and the last thing he wanted was to hurt her. But he couldn't ignore the truth of what he had seen. Her family, whether they realized it or not, harbored biases that had come to the surface when they were in a position of power. And now, he had to figure out how to navigate this new reality. "I don't think they're bad people, Emily," David said gently, reaching for her hand. "But that doesn't change what I saw. They've got some deeply ingrained prejudices, and whether they know it or not, it affects how they treat people. It's not something we can just ignore." Emily sniffled, nodding as she squeezed his hand. "You're right. I need time to process this. I need to talk to them." David nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach at the thought of what might happen next. He knew that confronting her family could go one of two ways. They could either acknowledge their behavior and work to change, or they could become defensive, unwilling to face the uncomfortable truths David had uncovered. Either way, it was going to be a difficult conversation. Later that week, Emily's family invited them to an engagement dinner at a fancy restaurant to celebrate the upcoming wedding. The mood was festive, with toasts and laughter filling the air. But for David, the evening felt like a ticking time bomb, with each passing moment bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. As the waiter poured champagne and Margaret raised her glass to toast the happy couple, David's mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking back to that day at McDonald's, the way Charles had complained about the service, the way Margaret had looked down on the workers, and the way Tom had carelessly tossed his trash on the table, as if the people cleaning up after him didn't matter. It gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Excuse me," David said, standing up and holding his own glass. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He could feel the weight of their expectation, their curiosity about what he was going to say. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his voice calm but steady. "But before I do, there's something I need to talk about, something that's been weighing on my mind." The tension in the room shifted slightly, a subtle undercurrent of unease passing through the group. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes wide with apprehension. She knew what was coming. David took a deep breath. "A few days ago I did something unconventional. I went undercover, working at a McDonald's near here. You all were there. You didn't recognize me, but I was the one who took your order, served your food, and watched how you treated the people around you. Charles frowned, confusion clouding his face. "What are you talking about?" David continued, his voice steady but firm. "I wanted to see how you would treat someone you didn't think was important, someone you didn't know. And what I saw, well, it wasn't what I hoped for." Margaret's face flushed, her eyes darting between David and Emily, clearly struggling to understand. "David, dear, what are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that when you thought I was just another worker, I saw the way you treated the staff. I saw the impatience, the dismissiveness, the way you acted like their jobs didn't matter, and it hurt." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of David's words sinking in. Charles sat back in his chair, his expression hardening. Tom shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Margaret looked stricken, her hand clutching her napkin tightly. "I didn't do this to embarrass anyone," David added, his tone softer now. "But I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand how you really see people like me, people who aren't wealthy or privileged." Emily's family sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to process what they had just heard. It was as if David had pulled back the curtain on a part of themselves they didn't want to see. The truth was out, and now they had to confront it, whether they wanted to or not. The silence that followed David's revelation hung in the air like a dense fog. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. The clinking of glasses and the soft hum of conversation from nearby tables, the only sounds breaking the tense quiet at their own. Emily's family sat frozen, a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and for some, a defensive edge creeping into their expressions. David felt the weight of each second pass, aware that this confrontation was about to shift the dynamics forever. Emily's face had gone pale, her eyes wide and filled with a deep, unsettling uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but seemed at a loss for words, torn between her loyalty to David and the loyalty to her family. This was the moment she had dreaded ever since David first shared his plan with her. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, that David's worst suspicions wouldn't be confirmed. But now, faced with the reality of his experiment, she didn't know where to turn. It was Charles who finally broke the silence, leaning back in his chair with an expression that hovered between disbelief and irritation. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but tinged with a sharpness that made it clear he wasn't pleased. "David, I don't know what you think you saw, but I'm not sure this little stunt of yours is fair." David kept his voice measured, though his heart was racing. "It wasn't a stunt, Charles. I wanted to see how you treated people when you didn't know who they were. And what I saw wasn't what I expected from a family that's supposed to be about kindness and respect." Charles's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward Margaret, who looked down at her napkin, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric. Tom, seated across from David, shifted uncomfortably, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with an awkward silence. "Kindness and respect?" Charles echoed, his tone clipped. "We've always been respectful to you, haven't we? Treated you like family?" David nodded slowly. "You've treated me that way because of who you think I am, because of my success, because I've made it. But that's exactly the point. When you thought I was just another worker at a fast food restaurant, you didn't show that same respect. And if you can't treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their status or what they do for a living, then what does that say?" Margaret finally found her voice, though it was shaky, her composure slipping. "David, we didn't mean anything by it. You know how things can be. People get impatient when they're hungry. And Tom, well, he's always been a bit careless with his words." Tom, who had been trying to avoid the conversation altogether, glanced up at the mention of his name, his face flushing red with embarrassment. He looked at David, then quickly away, clearly unsure of what to say. David felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's not about being careless or hungry. It's about the way you see people. You may not even realize it, but you treat people differently based on where they come from, what they look like, or how much money they make. That day when you thought I was just a worker, you didn't see me as someone worthy of the same respect you've shown me before. And that's not okay." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she rested them in her lap, her eyes darting between David and her parents. She had never seen her family like this, never been forced to confront the undercurrent of prejudice that David was now laying bare. It was as if the comfortable bubble she had always lived in had suddenly been burst, and she was struggling to find her footing in this new, uncomfortable reality. Emily began, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know it was like that. David turned to her, his expression softening slightly. I know you didn't, Emily, and this isn't about blaming you, but I needed you to see what I've been feeling for a long time. I needed you to understand why it's so important to me that your family accepts me, not just because I've been successful, but because I'm a person, no different from anyone else. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away, refusing to let herself break down in the middle of the restaurant. I understand, David. I do. But this is a lot to take in. David nodded, his voice gentle. I know. Charles, still visibly agitated, leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. I don't appreciate being accused of something that we haven't even had a chance to explain. You're painting us all with the same brush, but maybe we deserve a chance to respond before you make any more judgments. David tilted his head, meeting Charles's gaze evenly. I'm not accusing you of anything that I didn't see with my own eyes, but if you think there's something to explain, I'm listening. Charles sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, maybe we were a little impatient. It's not like we were rude, though, right? We didn't yell at anyone. We didn't cause a scene. Sure, Tom might have tossed his trash without thinking, but that's just who he is. He's careless. Margaret, she made a comment about cleanliness, but I don't think that's a crime. We've always treated people with respect, and I think you're blowing this out of proportion. David felt a flicker of anger at Charles's defensiveness, but he pushed it down, knowing that reacting in anger wouldn't help. It's not about causing a scene or yelling. It's about the subtle ways you show people you think they're less than you. You may not have noticed it, but the workers sure did. I did. It's the way you act like they're invisible, like their jobs don't matter, like their struggles aren't real. And whether you meant it or not, that's the message you sent. Margaret's voice was small, almost pleading. David, we've never seen you that way. We've always been proud of you. David gave her a sad smile. I know, but that's because I'm not who you expect a worker to be. And that's the problem. You respect me because I've succeeded in your world, but that shouldn't be the reason. It shouldn't matter if I'm working at McDonald's or running a tech company. Everyone deserves the same respect. Margaret looked away, clearly shaken by his words. Tom, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up, though his tone was defensive. Okay, maybe I was a bit of a jerk that day. I didn't mean anything by it, though. You know how it is. You go into a place like that, and it's just fast food, right? You don't really think about it. David turned to Tom, his eyes serious. But that's exactly the problem, Tom. You don't think about it. You don't think about the people who are working there, or what their lives might be like. To you, it's just a transaction. You order, they serve, and that's it. But to them, it's their livelihood. It's their job, and it deserves respect just like any other. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wrestling with his own guilt. He wasn't used to being called out like this, especially not by someone like David, who he had always admired for his success. But now, that admiration felt complicated, tangled up in the shame of realizing that he had never really seen David as an equal despite his success. Emily's tears had returned, and this time, she didn't try to stop them. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. David reached out and gently took her hand, his heart aching at the sight of her distress. You don't have to say anything right now. I know this is a lot to take in, but I needed to be honest with you, and with your family. I can't pretend like this doesn't matter, because it does. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of David's words seemed to settle over the table like a heavy fog, filling the space between them with an uncomfortable tension. Charles, who had always been the most composed member of the family, looked more rattled than David had ever seen him. Margaret, her usually cheerful demeanor shattered, seemed lost in thought, while Tom stared down at his plate, picking at the remnants of his meal without really seeing it. David could feel the strain in the room, the unspoken battle raging in each of their minds as they tried to reconcile what had just been revealed. He knew this wasn't something that could be resolved in one conversation, Changing deeply ingrained behaviors and attitudes took time, and he wasn't naive enough to believe that a single moment of truth would be enough to shift years of unconscious bias. But this was a start, a necessary, painful start. Emily was the first to speak again, her voice trembling but resolute. "I think we all need to take a step back and think about what David said. We can't just brush this under the rug." Charles opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret laid a hand on his arm, shaking her head. "She's right, Charles. This isn't something we can ignore." David exhaled slowly, relieved that Emily's family was at least willing to acknowledge the issue, even if they weren't ready to fully confront it yet. He stood, setting down his glass, and looked at each of them in turn. "I love Emily, and I want to be a part of this family, but I can't do that if we're not willing to face these uncomfortable truths. I don't expect perfection, but I do expect honesty and the willingness to change." With that, he turned to Emily, his expression softening. "I'll give you all the time you need to figure this out, but I won't stand by and pretend everything's okay when it's not." Emily nodded, her eyes full of unshed tears, and David knew that she understood. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new, more honest chapter in their relationship. But whether her family would be able to make the necessary changes remained to be seen. The days that followed the dinner were marked by an uneasy silence, both between David and Emily, and among Emily's family. It was as if the revelation had left everyone stunned, unsure of how to move forward. The tension lingered in the air, thick and palpable, like an unspoken truth no one wanted to address. For David, the discomfort was expected. He had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now they all had to walk through it, slowly, cautiously, and with no guarantee of what they would find on the other side. Emily hadn't spoken much since that evening. She wasn't angry, but she was processing, grappling with the reality of who her family was versus who she had always believed them to be. The duality of their actions, the kindness they had shown her and David on the surface, now seemed tarnished by the casual prejudices they had exhibited when they thought no one was watching. It was a lot for her to take in. One evening, about a week after the dinner, Emily finally broke the silence. They were sitting in their living room, the TV flickering with a show neither of them was paying attention to. Emily's eyes were red from crying, her expression weary from the emotional weight she had been carrying. "I talked to my mom today," she said quietly, her voice strained but steady. David turned to her, his heart heavy. "How did it go?" Emily took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to relive the conversation. She admitted that she hadn't realized how her behavior came across. She said she never thought about how it might feel to someone like you, or the workers at the restaurant. It was hard for her to hear, but I think she's starting to understand. David nodded slowly. "That's a start." Emily's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "But my dad, he's not there yet. He still doesn't think he did anything wrong. He keeps saying he's always been respectful to you, that you're blowing things out of proportion. He won't even acknowledge that there's a deeper issue." David felt a familiar pang of frustration, though it wasn't unexpected. Charles was proud, deeply rooted in his own worldview. A man who had lived his life in a bubble of wealth and privilege, he likely couldn't see the ways his attitudes shaped his actions and how those actions could be harmful. David had hoped for more, but he also knew that change wasn't something that happened overnight. "What about Tom?" David asked, though he could already guess the answer. Emily gave a small, humorless laugh. "Tom's embarrassed. He knows he acted like a jerk, but he doesn't want to talk about it. He's avoiding the whole thing, like he always does when things get uncomfortable." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was the same pattern he had seen time and time again. When people were confronted with their own biases, many chose to retreat, to hide behind defensiveness or avoidance. It was easier to pretend the problem didn't exist than to confront the messy, uncomfortable truth of their own behavior. Emily looked over at him, her eyes pleading. "I don't know what to do, David. I love you, and I love my family, but I feel like I'm stuck between two worlds. I want to believe that they can change, that they can see what you've been trying to show them. But I'm scared. What if they don't?" David reached over and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. I know this is hard, Emily, but you have to give them time. Some people aren't ready to face the truth all at once. It takes time for people to really reflect on their actions and understand what needs to change. I'm not asking them to be perfect, but I am asking them to be willing to grow. Emily squeezed his hand tightly, as if drawing strength from his words. And if they can't, what happens then? David's heart ached at the question, the uncertainty that hung between them like a dark cloud. Then we'll have to figure that out when the time comes. But for now, let's give them a chance. People can surprise you. Sometimes, the ones who resist change the most are the ones who end up growing the most. Over the next few weeks, David noticed small shifts in Emily's family, though the changes were subtle and uneven. Margaret seemed the most affected by David's words. She had always prided herself on her kindness and charity work, but now she was starting to see how her actions hadn't always aligned with her intentions. She began volunteering more frequently, not just at high-profile charity events, but at local shelters and community centers, working directly with people from all walks of life. It was clear that she was making an effort to expand her worldview, to challenge her own assumptions. One afternoon, Margaret invited David to join her at a community outreach event she was organizing. Hesitant but hopeful, David agreed. As they handed out food and supplies to those in need, Margaret seemed quieter than usual, more thoughtful. At one point, she turned to David, her voice soft but sincere. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, David," she admitted, her eyes focused on the task in front of her. "About how we treat people. I never thought of myself as someone who looked down on others. But I realize now that it's not just about how we act when things are easy. It's about how we treat people when no one's watching, when it doesn't benefit us." David glanced at her, surprised by her candor. "I appreciate that, Margaret. It's not easy to reflect on that kind of thing." She nodded, her expression serious. "I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm trying. I want to be better. For you, for Emily, and for myself." It was a small step, but it was meaningful. David felt a flicker of hope, knowing that at least one member of the family was willing to put in the work to change. Charles, on the other hand, remained stubbornly resistant. He had grown quieter in the days following the dinner, avoiding direct conversations about the incident, but clearly stewing in his own thoughts. David knew that Charles's pride was one of his greatest barriers. He was a man who had built his life around control and authority, and the idea that he had acted in a way that was less than honorable was something he couldn't easily accept. One evening, as David and Emily were preparing for bed, Charles called David out of the blue. His voice was tense, clipped, but there was something different about it, something that suggested he had been wrestling with his own internal conflict. "David," Charles began, his tone formal, "I've been thinking about what you said that night. I don't agree with everything, but I can see that maybe I've overlooked certain things. I've never thought of myself as prejudiced, but I suppose there are things I haven't considered." David listened carefully, noting the hesitation in Charles's voice. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest Charles had come to acknowledging that there might be some truth to what David had pointed out. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't part of the family," Charles continued, his voice a little softer now. "I hope you know that." David sighed, appreciating the effort, even if it wasn't the full acknowledgement he had hoped for. "I do, Charles, but this isn't just about me. It's about how we treat everyone, not just the people we know or care about." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Charles spoke again, quieter this time. "I'll think about that." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tom, for his part, had mostly avoided David since the dinner, embarrassed by his behavior and unsure how to make amends. One afternoon, however, he showed up at David and Emily's apartment, unexpectedly, his hands shoved in his pockets and his usual bravado noticeably absent. "Hey," Tom said awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. David raised an eyebrow, surprised to see him. "Hey." Tom looked down at the ground, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I know I was a jerk. I didn't think about what I was doing, and I'm sorry for that." David crossed his arms, watching Tom closely. "It's not just about that one time, Tom. It's about the way you see people." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "I know. I guess I've always just taken things for granted. I never really thought about what it's like for other people, but after what you said, I've been thinking about it more. I don't want to be that guy who treats people like they don't matter. David softened slightly, appreciating Tom's honesty. It's a good first step, Tom, but it's not just about saying it, it's about showing it too. Tom nodded again, his face earnest. I'll work on it. As the weeks turned into months, the tension between David and Emily's family slowly began to ease. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Charles remained guarded, and Tom still struggled with his old habits. But there was progress. And that progress gave David hope. Emily, too, had grown through the experience. She had always been kind and compassionate, but now she was more aware of the ways her family's behavior had shaped her own worldview. She had learned to challenge her own assumptions, to speak up when she saw something wrong, and to support David in his efforts to create change. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset over the horizon, Emily turned to David, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. David looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For being patient with me," she said, her voice soft, "for helping me see the world in a different way. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm sorry for everything you had to go through, but I'm so grateful for you, for us." David smiled, squeezing her hand. "I'm grateful for you too, and I'm proud of you, Emily. You've grown so much." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "We'll keep growing together." And in that moment, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had learned the power of empathy, the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, and the transformative potential of love and understanding. And that, more than anything, was the lesson that would guide them forward. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.